Dealing with a rise in murder. On this edition of Inside Story Americas, we look at what's behind the dramatic increase in Chicago this year and what can be done to address it. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. For years, the murder rate in Chicago had been decreasing, but this year has been different. Through the end of July, the number of murders in the US's third largest city was more than 25% higher than it was during that same time period in 2011. After a stray bullet killed 7-year-old Heaven Sutton outside her home, Chicago's mayor pointed to the city's gangs as the root of the problem. Community organisers, though, say the rise in murders is a result of failed urban policies. Systemic change is needed, and not simply a police crackdown, they argue. It's also important to note that it's too soon to make a judgment on whether this is the beginning of a long-term trend. In fact, July in Chicago saw fewer murders than in the same month last year. So, what is causing the rise in murders and what can be done to stem it? Joining us from Chicago is Willie Cochran. He's the alderman or city councilman for Ward 20 in Chicago. That's one of the areas where there's been a rise in the number of homicides. Also in Chicago, Harold Pollack, the co-director of the University of Chicago Crime Lab. And joining me here in the studio is Tyrone Parker, founder of the Alliance for Concerned Men, a group that has had a high degree of success in reaching out to at-risk youth here in Washington, D.C. I thought what we do first of all is take a closer look at some of the statistics and contextualize them a bit more, because as we look through some of the information and the stories being written on this topic, it did seem like a lot of conclusions were being reached a little prematurely. So let's run through them. Chicago's police department keeps track of murder rates in the city. According to them, then, there were 319 murders in Chicago this year as of August the 5th. There were 433 murders in all of 2011. And that was down 6% from 2010, when there were 436. And overall murder numbers in Chicago have been falling for years. In 2005, there were 451. And that's a dramatic drop from 2000, when there was 633 murders, or there were 633 murders. And that's still far less than the number of homicides in Chicago in the early 90s, when there were often close to 1,000 murders per year. Professor, then help us contextualize this year's figures, which are alarming, but help us put it into that long-term downward trend, or put into the context of that long-term downward trend.
Well, I think there's no doubt that this year is a cause for concern. Some of these rates do fluctuate quite a lot. It's a little bit like the stock market, where people make a lot of prognostications based on numbers that move around. We had very good weather in the early parts of the year, and that's actually one of the risk factors for homicide. So in March and April, we saw pretty high numbers that may partly reflect that. But it's certainly something that bears watching, and in a fundamental way, we have significantly higher homicide rates than either Los Angeles or New York City. So we certainly have a lot to be concerned about in Chicago. Whether or not this year's fluctuation turns out to be part of a longer-term disturbing trend. Right.
We can look at those nationwide figures, or at least get a sense of them, and compare them to Washington, D.C., New York, and Los Angeles. In Washington, D.C., there have been 56 homicides as of August the 20th. At this time in 2011, there had been 70. New York City tracks murders, and there were 246 murders there as of August 5th. In 2011, however, there were 298. And in the city of Los Angeles, there have been 174 homicides through August the 4th of this year. That compares to 173 homicides in LA for the same time period last year. So that's actually relatively constant. But Alderman Willie Cochran, I mean, how do you fit Chicago's spike in homicides this year with that nationwide downward trend? What do you feel is going on?
Well, I think the guns have saturated our community and got into the hands of people who are irresponsible for handling those guns. And that means they're in the hands of younger people who now are shooting younger people and older people.
But is this a recent phenomenon then?
It is a recent phenomenon, and that recent phenomenon, I think, is associated with the foreclosure issue as well. The foreclosure issue has made homes that have come back on the market available for investors, and those investors have put people into those homes that have poor character, poor character development, don't understand what it is to introduce them into communities that have been stable communities for a long time, and they bring bad characteristics with them, and identify a community that has good characteristics as a community that can now become part of their turf. And you put a number of...
No, go ahead, sorry.
You put a number of those homes and tenants in place like that around different parts of the community, and now you have developments of little satellite gangs and crews that now take charge of 3-4 blocks, and now you have 5, 6, 10 in the area that has been most difficult for me in my ward. We have about 12 different gangs in a 20 square block area. And so now you have the conflicts because they're coming into contact with one another more and more, and they're younger and younger.
Professor, I mean, from the social scientist perspective then, I mean, let's go through some of those issues. Has there been any sudden increase in the access to guns amongst young people in some of these areas in Chicago, as far as you can tell?
Well, I think it's a chronic issue. If you look at gun seizures on a per capita basis, the Chicago Police Department captures something like 6 times the amount of guns that they do in New York City. And we do have a problem that there's relatively easy access to guns. Chicago actually has very stringent gun safety regulations, but many of the surrounding areas do not. And so we do have a significant issue there with the guns. If you actually compare Chicago with many of the major Western European cities, you would find that if you want to get mugged, you could actually get mugged quite readily in the London Tube, or you want to get your car stolen, that'll happen in Stockholm more commonly than it will in Chicago. But they have fewer dead bodies, and it's basically because of the high presence of guns. So there's no question that dealing with the gun issue is one of the central issues that we have. Alderman Cochran mentioned a couple of other issues. I'll just mention briefly. One ironic issue that we have is we've done a pretty good job of capturing a lot of the leading figures in some of the larger gangs in Chicago and other cities. But one of the side effects of that is that some of these gangs have fractionated, and you now have, where you had one gang with a clear hierarchy, we've sort of decapitated the hierarchy. But instead of going away, the pieces of the gang then become separate little sub-gangs that can sometimes themselves become a serious problem. And now it's a little harder to police some of the violence issues that these littler units can create. It's a little bit like if you just kill Mr. Big and Al Qaeda. Now you have these different cells below that level, which become a different kind of a problem to deal with.
Right, so I suppose that will speak to then some of the systemic issues which we'll get onto. Actually, there was some research from a Columbia University academic who suggested that while some of these gangs were in large units and making lots of money from drugs, it was in their interest actually to keep the peace because they didn't want the attention of the police. Is that correct?
One of the issues that we have, some of the more creative law enforcement strategies involve understanding just the dynamic that you were describing. The gangs do not want to have violence that interferes with, with their economic activities. So if you can convince adults who are involved in various drug-selling organizations, for example, that if young people associated with them commit gun crimes, that this will come back on them, they have an incentive to try to make sure that the young people that they employ or that they influence are not carrying guns or not using guns. And Chicago and other cities are actually trying to do that. There's a gentleman named David Kennedy who's pursued a number of innovative strategies to try to deal with that nexus there. So there's certainly some truth to that.
Alderman, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, if you look at the statistics and you look at those communities where we're having these challenges at, you'll find a community that is oppressed economically, that has had a history of bad education and family structure. Where as a result of that, the systems that have been in place have failed these people in such a way that all of us are now suffering from that. Poor education, poor training, lack of ability to get a job, unemployment rate sky high, housing in poor condition, and families having to move as a result over and over again. And that means that one child may end up in 3 different schools over a school year because parents can't pay for their rent. And so there are a number of different system failures that are contributing here. We don't have the economic base that we need, jobs and the training and the ability to learn the training.
I've seen the perception then in some corners that as long as this was simply poor African Americans killing other poor African Americans, it wasn't a priority. Is that too simplistic, would you say, Alderman?
Well, if you look at history, the disinvestment in the communities have been in Afro-American communities. The disinvestment in the education has been in the Afro-American communities. Historically, you look back on the time when social services and welfare was initiated. They initiated it meant that the woman could not have a man in the household. And so you broke down the household intentionally if you wanted to receive any kind of subsidies. So this is a long-growing effect that has affected our communities to the point now where we are suffering from it big time, and we're trying to scramble to try and recover.
So Tyrone Parker, then, from your experience in Washington, D.C., though, some of this must be sounding rather familiar.
No question about it. As I hear both gentlemen make mention of the different concerns and what their thoughts are, it relates to even the District of Columbia. I hear what Willie's saying in the contents of the communities and how they basically have deteriorated, and they've been deteriorated on watch. It's senseless for us to have lost as many kids that we've lost across this country, and for this not to have been a priority of this country, but simply because these were black kids were we able to lose kids of the numbers. Professor, I'm also a part of the National Network for Safer Communities, which is David Kennedy. And we primarily participate in some of his extraordinary suggestions and solutions. I think David's solution in regards to how do we sustain our success in the contents of building the community up, building the infrastructure, the natural resources that we have in a number of these communities is our key. The District of Columbia, we got fortunate, Willie. We basically caught the attention of our mayor and demanded that resources be channeled into our particular communities, specifically our correctional facilities, where so many of our youth and young kids was coming from. But we also helped to change the culture of our kids and the contents of their thinking and what became fashionable to them in their communities.
Is it simply about changing the culture of the kids, but also changing the behavior and the attitudes of the police force and the authorities as well?
It's a combination. You know, our kids look at the police as their enemies, you know, and they basically don't see them as public servants. One of the contentions of the Alliance of Concerned Men, we taught our kids that these police are not there just to harass, but also to serve and to protect. And we began to build relationships with the police, bringing them in to do life skills, letting them understand that the police have major concerns about their communities as well. But as I said, one of the greatest things that we were able to accomplish, we were able to go into our correctional facilities and to bring those individuals that were incarcerated as being a part of our solution, because we felt that the solution was in the problem. And we became we're turning the ocean liner around. It hadn't been the silver bullet, but the ocean liner is turning in the District of Columbia. I lost a son, you know, that hadn't been killed by, violence, you know. So I understand the impact of it, but I also understand that there are solutions that the people have the capability.
Professor, the mayor, Rahm Emanuels of Chicago, does say that he does that his attention has been caught by this problem. What has been his and his police superintendent's reaction to this? Are they taking the sort of measures that you think will be constructive and conducive to reducing this homicide and murder level?
Well, I think that they are. There is a real range of evidence-based approaches that methodically try to do what we know works, and they're really trying hard to implement those things. You know, for example, we know that helping young people deal with conflicts and dealing more productively with other children is often a very effective way to prevent things that could escalate into violence. And we and others have been fielding interventions to try to help young people, and some of these have been found to reduce violence. When we look at Our police department is trying a number of innovative things. I think that they're basically trying to do the things that we have a good reason to think will be effective. In general, I think that, yes, they are. But a number of points have come up in the conversation that I just want to mention.
Please.
One is the depth of the the depth of the economic crisis in low-income communities is really hard for outsiders to fully understand. And it matters in two ways. One is, as the alderman mentioned, and as Mr. Parker mentioned, everyday people are profoundly affected by joblessness and by lack of educational opportunities. And also, our state and local governments are in very serious financial shape, and that affects their ability to, for example, have the level of law enforcement that's really required to do what's needed in these communities. So I think that the depth of the recession is something that is really quite profound. And of course, the housing crisis is a central element of that. So I think that we can't lose sight of that. I also think, though, that we have to remember that even with a high level of unemployment and poverty and all these other challenges, there are a lot of things we could do that would effectively reduce violence. And so we can't become discouraged by thinking we have to deal with all of these fundamental social problems before we see it. Well, I think in schools, for example, getting kids involved with mentors and bringing mature adults in contact with kids and helping them regulate their own behaviors, helping them not only set long-term goals, but understand what they have to do to achieve those goals in a practical way on a day-to-day basis, working with kids to improve their attendance, dealing with our truancy problem. There's a variety of interventions. There's no magic bullet out there. There's no polio vaccine that's going to be found for this problem. But there are a number of interventions that we are doing, other people are doing, that are making a difference, and that I'm confident we are going to bring these homicide rates down. I think as long as we stay at it in a methodical and evidence-based way, we're going to make progress.
Alderman, clearly you're at the front line of all of this. What is your experience then? Are you as optimistic and hopeful then as the professor?
Yes, I am optimistic and hopeful. I spent 25 years on the police department before I became an elected official, on working the streets, in those very streets that are now the biggest challenge for us. 7, 8 years as a beat officer out there. And I've seen the changes, and I was on the job when the homicide rate was at its highest level in Chicago at all times, and in the same areas across the city, across the district that is being affected. And yeah, I do see a great deal of hope. I know that there have been some changes. I think the economic challenges that we've had as a nation, as a country, as a world, we have never seen before. And that has posed a lot of different problems.
But what are you specifically asking for?
We're trying to get through those. What am I specifically asking for? I'm specifically asking for the citizens to understand that we do need more police officers. We need to be able to apply those police officers in the appropriate way. We do need the after-school programs. We do need to have boarding schools again, because some of those children don't want to be in those environments. And when we take them out of those environments, we have to understand that what they see as normal does not mean normal anymore. But if we keep children and young adults in those environments where they don't want to be, or they're locked into being because of social conditions or economic conditions, then we make the next generation of people who see murder, shooting, lack of as normal. And so we need to take them out of their environment. We need to have better schools. We need to have better investment. If somebody's going to invest downtown, we need to have practical investment out in the neighborhoods where job creation can be. We need to be able to take that focus group and that time that we have for children in class to build families, to build character. There was a time when we built character in people when we were trying to build America and their families.
Right, but as you've both suggested,
that's what I'm advocating for.
As you've all suggested, you're saying this at a time when the dominant economic and political theme, especially with local government, is austerity. And the money isn't there. They're not going to spend it. They're actually the first, the philosophy seems to be, let's cut the budget at whatever cost to please bond traders and so forth. It isn't about thinking about the social cost of all this. So what hope is there of making that systemic change then? Professor, you seem to be about to say something.
I think that's I must say, I think that's a huge mistake, and I think that it's something we have to be very clear. When our financial system was in crisis, we were able to find hundreds of billions of dollars in order to deal with that problem because a large group of people understood that our society just could not stand idly by while our financial system was teetering. And here, the social and human cost of what's happening now in Chicago and many other places is every bit as profound. And I think that we need the right mix of patience and urgency about this problem. We need a sense of urgency that people really are being shot every day all across America, and there are many things that we can do to reduce this problem. And I think this austerity mindset is very short-sighted, and it will not lead us to a safer and more prosperous society, and it certainly will not address the problems that we are having. I must say, on the flip side of that, I do think we also have an obligation, those of us who are asking for more resources, to show that those resources will actually be used well. And, you know, I come out of a public health background. In public health, we've done randomized trials to really demonstrate the effectiveness of interventions. We need to take the same approach to law enforcement and to other things that we do in criminal justice to understand, you know, is the money well spent and what kind of results are we getting?
But Alderman, I mean, you quite controversially, I think, have said, well, maybe we need to have a stop and frisk system as they do in New York. And do correct me if I'm wrong on that. I mean, the suspicion that one gets is without the other elements of systemic change, all you get then is a crackdown which increases mistrust between the police and communities, alienates more people because, frankly, such programs are so open to abuse by the police force.
Well, I have to say this, that stop and frisk has always been a way that professional law enforcement has been taught. And police officers always have had the right to stop and frisk. The problem has been is that they have not been doing it, and as a result of that, it has led to this drive-by shootings. I stop and I frisk a car, I find a gun. I stop and I frisk individuals in an area where there are gang conflicts at, I find a gun and I take that gun off the street and I incarcerate the person that has it. This has to be taken in a compound way where we take those offenders who are violent and we have to remove them off the street.
Right, but if 10,000 guns are already being seized by Chicago police every year and the homicide rate is going up anyway, what difference, I mean, is this really where we should be focusing?
Well, again, like I was saying, yeah. I think we need to focus on various areas. Right. One, we need to continue to do the stop and frisk. We need to continue to work on our education policies. We need to continue to work on our family issues. And we need to take those dollars that are being found for NATO or the Olympics from voluntarily organizations and companies, and use those kind of dollars to increase all of those areas that need to be increased. Human capital is just as important as any other capital. All
right, we're running out of time, unfortunately. Tyrone Poker, give us then your experience. How do you make that change then, you know, so again, the police are seen as part of the community. How do you, and I think you also kind of look at it in a kind of a public health sense. You know, crime isn't mindless violence, but causal and can be treated at the source and so forth. I mean, we only have a minute left, I'm afraid.
Well, you know, I think and both gentlemen are absolutely correct, but I think from the community perspective, where we understand the need to survive regardless of what the circumstances may be, and there is a natural resource in our community that's not being tapped, nor is it being built on. The kids have a saying that said the grandparents are the last of the good people, which means they understand the aspect of people doing good things. These individuals can help to transform the communities if we build our communities, give the substance that needs to be given in regards to our communities. This is a natural resource. And also on the table for the Alliance of Concerned Men is our prison population, the many fathers and mothers that's confined in these facilities. We got to figure out ways, how do we utilize that energy to channel back into public safety at a time when their minds are clear and their hearts are open and they want to do positive things for their communities.
And they will have to leave it. Tyrone Parker, thank you very much. Professor Harold Pollack, thank you too. Alderman Willie Cochran, thank you.
Thank you.
See you guys.
You're welcome.
And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Thanks also to our new viewers on Link TV for joining us. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.